The day the Ithari came, every star in the Kesov system dimmed. Not metaphorically, not poetically. The instruments recorded it, a measurable drop in stellar output across 4 suns, as though the universe itself was holding its breath. 47 vessels materialized from folded space above Kesov Prime, each one larger than any moon humanity had ever charted. They moved in silence, without engine wash, without radiation signature, without any physical law that human science had yet written a chapter for. Commander Dale Auric was the first to see them on the bridge of the patrol frigate Cassidy. He had served 22 years in the outer frontier. He had survived the Keth Plague response, the machine succession border wars, and 3 tours in the dead zone past the Kira Rift. He was not a man given to fear. He sat down slowly, quietly, and stared. The Ithari had not visited this sector in 3 centuries. Most species across the conquered of worlds had quietly hoped they never would again. The last visit had ended with the Vel homeworld stripped of its government, its treasury, and a third of its population, all surrendered without a single shot fired, because that was what you did when the Ithari arrived. You gave them what they asked. You did not look them in the eye. You waited until they left, and then you cried in private. The transmission came 11 minutes after their arrival. Not on any known frequency, it simply appeared in every communication system in the Kesov system simultaneously. It was not in any language exactly. It was closer to a feeling placed directly behind the eyes, behind the sternum, behind every instinct a conscious mind possessed. The message was not complicated. We are here, you will provide. The Sarathi ambassador above Kesov Prime complied within 40 seconds. The Vel trade delegation complied in under 3 minutes. The Dun colonial governor, a species known for their stubbornness, held out for 8 whole minutes before their senior council collapsed into ritual prostration. Then the Ithari turned to the human ship. The Cassidy was a patrol frigate, light armament, crew of 64, designed for border monitoring and emergency response. She was, by any military metric, completely irrelevant to the situation. Commander Auric knew this. His crew knew this. They had watched every other species in the system fold like paper in warm water, and they understood rationally that the correct response was the same. Auric opened a channel to the Ithari flagship. This is Commander Dale Auric of the UES Cassidy, United Earth Naval Command. We've received your transmission. He paused. Can you clarify what specifically you're requesting, and under what legal framework this request is being made? The silence that followed lasted 4 minutes and 37 seconds. Later, analysts would study that silence extensively. Some argued it was processing time, that the Ithari were genuinely confused by the response. Others believed it was the first time in centuries that a species had asked them for paperwork. A few historians pointed out that no entity which had never been questioned could possibly have been prepared to be questioned, and that 4 minutes was, all things considered, a very fast recovery. The response when it came was different from the first transmission. Sharper, colder. It arrived not as a feeling but as a sound, a resonant, many-layered chord that vibrated the hull of the Cassidy and made the teeth of every crew member ache simultaneously. You will provide, or you will be instructed further. Auric looked at his communications officer, then at his first mate, then at the sensor display showing 47 vessels, each roughly the size of a continent, arranged above his ship like a ceiling made of gods. He keyed his personal log. Cassidy log, stardate 2847.11, making contact with Ithari delegation above Kesov Prime. Request has been received, forwarding to Earth Command for guidance. He paused. Recommend they take this one seriously. He sent the message. Then he made coffee, because there was nothing else useful to do, and waited for humanity to decide what kind of species it was going to be. Earth Command's response arrived in 90 minutes. Ambassador Mara Tessin was already on a shuttle. She had not waited for the official order. The moment Auric's transmission reached the relay station at Kesov Gate, Tessin had pulled her go bag from under her bunk on the diplomatic vessel Patience, told her assistant to cancel everything for the next month, and booked herself aboard the first transport heading inward. She had spent 11 years as humanity's lead negotiator across the conquered of worlds. She had sat across tables from species that communicated through ultraviolet bioluminescence, species that experienced time nonlinearly, and once memorably, a species that conducted all diplomacy through interpretive silence lasting 3 days. She was, by professional reputation, unshakable. By personal reputation, she was simply strange. The Ithari flagship did not extend a docking invitation. It extended something else, a column of amber light that reached from the vessel's underside to the shuttle's hull and simply drew them in. Tesson's pilot grabbed the manual override. Tesson gently put her hand on his arm. "Let them," she said. The hangar they entered was not built for human scale. It was built for beings of light and resonance, which meant it was approximately 3 kilometers wide, illuminated by sourceless gold radiance, and smelled somehow of something between ozone and old rain. 4 Ithari stood waiting, or hovered. The distinction was academic. They were roughly humanoid in silhouette but composed of layered luminescence, edges constantly shifting, internal structures moving like weather systems seen from orbit. They were, objectively, the most beautiful things Mara Tesson had ever seen. She flipped open her notepad and clicked her pen. The Ithari sent the feeling again, the one that had dropped the Vel ambassador to his knees and caused the Dun governor to weep openly. The full experience, glory, terror, insignificance, the crushing weight of eternity pressing down on a single mortal mind. It was designed to produce prostration. It was calibrated across millennia of practice. It had never failed. Tesson wrote, "Psychic pressure seems involuntary or habitual, note for later." One of the Ithari, she would later designate it Speaker 1 in her report, moved closer. The pressure intensified. The air around Tesson shimmered with contained energy. It leaned toward her in a way that suggested looking, though it had no eyes in any human sense. "You do not kneel," it said. The voice bypassed her ears entirely and arrived already translated somewhere behind her temples. "Not on a first meeting," she said pleasantly. "It sets a bad precedent." Another long silence. The 4 beings exchanged something between themselves, not sound, not light, but a shift in the quality of the air that her instruments recorded as a minor gravitational fluctuation. She noted that too. They showed her the tribute records, 3,000 years of accumulated compliance from 49 species across 11 sectors. Every entry logged with the same notation, submitted without incident. It was, she had to admit, an impressive administrative document. She asked for a copy. They did not give her one, but she photographed 12 pages before they realized what she was doing. They asked what humanity would provide. She said humanity would need to consult its governing bodies and would respond within 30 standard days. Speaker 1 made a sound like collapsing stars. "Others do not require 30 days, it said. "Others," Tesson replied, capping her pen, "didn't ask for a legal framework," she smiled. "We take our commitments seriously. That means we think before we make them." They released her shuttle 2 hours later. She spent the entire return flight writing her report, cross-referencing the tribute records she'd photographed, and eating a protein bar she'd had in her jacket pocket since Tuesday. Her report to Earth Command was 14 pages. The summary on page 1 read, "They are powerful beyond current military engagement thresholds. They are also institutionally incapable of understanding refusal. This is their greatest vulnerability. Recommend we use it." At the bottom, in her own handwriting, she had added a note. "They expected me to be afraid. I was. I just had a job to do. Earth did not panic. That surprised almost everyone." The Concord news feeds ran the Kesov footage for 72 consecutive hours. The visual of 47 Ithari vessels hanging above a planet like a second sky, transmitted in high resolution by the Cassidy's external cameras before Auric had the presence of mind to stop broadcasting, became the most viewed piece of footage in human history within 48 hours. Protests erupted on 7 colony worlds. Emergency sessions were called in 9 legislative bodies. 3 separate religious movements declared the end of everything and attracted, combined, roughly 4 million followers. Earth Command met in closed session for 6 days. On the 7th day, they brought in Dr. Alu Adiz. Adiz was 61 years old, broadly built, and wore the perpetually distracted expression of a man whose brain was always halfway through an argument with itself. He held the chair of Xenomilitary History at the University of New Accra and had spent 30 years studying every conflict in conquered space going back 4 millennia. He was not a warm presence. He was not a comforting one. But when he stood at the briefing room's center display and pulled up the Ithari's 3,000-year military record, every admiral in the room went very quiet. "They have never lost a battle," Adiz said. "That is the headline. That is what everyone is focused on." He clicked through the record. "Here is what no one is talking about. They have not fought a battle in 1,012 years." He let that land. Every engagement in the last millennium has been resolved by the target's voluntary submission before any weapons were discharged. The Ithari walk in. Everyone falls down. The Ithari leave with what they came for. He folded his hands behind his back. That is not military dominance. That is the reputation of military dominance. And reputation, unlike armor, does not actually stop projectiles. Admiral Sira Voss, seated at the end of the table, leaned forward. She was 54, compact, with short gray hair and the particular stillness of someone who had made life-and-death decisions so many times the process had become internal. "You're saying they're untested." "I'm saying they haven't been in a real fight since before most of the species in this room's governments existed. And we have." Adiz pulled up a secondary display, humanity's own military history since first contact. The Keth Plague response, the silence at Vega, the machine succession which had lasted 11 years and consumed 4 fleets and produced, in the process, an entire generation of officers who had learned to fight things that did not negotiate, did not feel, and did not stop. We have been at war in one form or another for 600 years, not because we are violent, because everything we encountered in the outer dark was. He paused. We did not survive that by kneeling. The Joint Command voted that evening. The authorization was carefully worded. The first Expeditionary Armada, 17 vessels including 4 dreadnoughts, 6 cruisers, and 7 support-capable destroyers, was to deploy to the Kesov sector under Admiral Voss. Mission parameters: demonstrate capability, not aggression, not threat, demonstration. The distinction mattered both diplomatically and, everyone privately hoped, legally. Voss spent the journey to Kesov in her quarters with Tesson's report, Adiz's briefing files, and 17 years of mission logs from the machine succession. She read everything twice. She made notes in the margins in handwriting so small her aide had to photograph the pages to read them. On the last night before arrival, she went to the observation deck of her flagship, the Unbroken, and looked at the stars for a long time. She was not afraid. She was something more useful than afraid. She was ready. The Unbroken dropped out of FTL at 6:12 hours, Kesov Standard Time, without stealth, without cloaking, and without the courtesy of a flight path notification to Ithari traffic control, which did not exist because no one had ever needed to file a flight path before. 16 warships emerged behind her in formation. The Ithari vessels registered their arrival immediately. 7 of the 47 ships repositioned, turning their forward aspects toward the human fleet, the equivalent, Voss's intelligence officer noted, of someone in a dark room turning to face you. It was not yet an attack posture. It was attention. Voss opened a broadcast on every frequency the Conquered used, +4 that only the Ithari were known to monitor. "This is Admiral Sira Voss, United Earth Naval Command, commanding the 1st Expeditionary Armada. We are here as representatives of humanity in response to the tribute request issued at Kesov Prime 16 days ago." She paused precisely long enough to let anyone listening absorb that. "We have prepared a response. We would like to demonstrate it." She nodded to her weapons officer. Target, designated Moon, Kesov system, uninhabited, geological survey completed and cleared. Distance, 400,000 kilometers. What followed was not a single shot. It was a coordinated sequence, the kind of firing solution that had been developed, refined, and tested across a decade of machine succession combat, calibrated for maximum efficiency against targets that could regenerate, adapt, and think. 6 ships fired simultaneously. The result was not an explosion in any traditional sense. It was an erasure. The Moon, 2.3 billion tons of rock and iron, came apart in 11 seconds and continued coming apart for another 40 minutes as the chain reaction propagated through the debris field. The shockwave reached the Ithari flagship 7 minutes later. Voss had kept the channel open. "That," she said into the silence, "is what we bring to a conversation." Across the conquered relay network, in observation posts and diplomatic vessels and private quarters and public halls on 49 worlds, the footage played and replayed. The Sarathi ambassador watched it 9 times. The Vel delegation watched it with the lights off and didn't speak for an hour afterward. A done philosopher who had spent 30 years writing theology centered on Ithari divinity watched it once, closed his notebook, and went for a very long walk. The Ithari flagship did not move. It did not respond for 11 minutes and 40 seconds. When Speaker One's transmission finally arrived on Voss's bridge, it carried the old psychic pressure, but something else alongside it now. Something that her crew's biometrics would later flag as an involuntary response in themselves. A recognition, ancient and animal, of something it had no word for yet. "You have made a statement," Speaker One said. "Yes," Voss replied, "we're good at that." She leaned back in her chair. "We're better at following through." The channel closed. Voss looked at her tactical officer. "Keep the fleet at condition 2. Nobody fires without my direct order." She stood up. "Get me Tessin. We've started the conversation. She gets to finish it." The Herald arrived without warning on the 43rd day. There had been 3 weeks of tense, circling diplomacy, Tessin aboard the Patience, Speaker One aboard the flagship, trading careful transmissions while the fleets held their positions, and the rest of the Conquered held its collective breath. Progress, by any measure, was non-existent. The Ithari did not negotiate. They waited for the other party to realize it was being ridiculous and submit. Tessin kept asking for a written agenda. Speaker One kept sending feelings of cosmic inevitability. Neither side blinked. Then the Herald came, and blinking stopped mattering. It was not a ship. It was not, technically, a weapon. The Ithari records that Tessin had photographed described it in terms that translated approximately as the instrument of final instruction, a singular entity, older than the Ithari fleet itself, capable of unmade matter at the quantum substrate. In practical terms, it could dissolve a vessel from the inside out, unraveling molecular bonds without heat, without explosion, without any of the warning signatures that human point defense systems were designed to detect. It appeared 11 kilometers off the Unbroken's port bow. The first indication was a soft alarm, hull integrity sensors reading a localized field effect that didn't match any weapon profile in the database. Then the field began to spread, and the outer hull of the Unbroken's port section started coming apart at the seam like wet paper. Voss had 17 seconds to make a decision. Later in the inquiry, she would describe those 17 seconds as very clear. Not slow, clear. Everything irrelevant fell away. She saw what she had. She knew what it could do. She gave the order. The Unbroken fired everything. Not at maximum yield. Maximum yield was calibrated for fixed targets. What Voss ordered was something the machine succession had developed specifically for enemies that moved like thought and didn't stay in one place long enough for a targeting lock. A distributed salvo, overlapping fields, forcing the target to be somewhere that was being hit regardless of where it moved. The Herald had never been hit before. This was, the subsequent analysis would determine, its primary tactical weakness. It was old. It was immensely powerful. It had, across 4,000 years of service, encountered exactly 0 opponents who had the combination of firepower, targeting solutions, and institutional willingness to actually pull the trigger. Every previous target had dissolved in awe before it could get close enough to do damage. The unbroken salvo caught it at 7 kilometers. 6 destroyers added their fire half a second later. The Herald screamed. The sound was not acoustic. It arrived as pure sensation across every conscious mind in the system, a sound like reality tearing. Then it was gone, folded back to etheric space, trailing something that the sensors could only describe as energetic hemorrhage. It was wounded. Not destroyed, not killed, but wounded visibly, measurably in retreat. On 49 worlds across the Concord, in every observation post and diplomatic relay that had been watching the HFY system, the footage played. A being that had been described as divine. A being that had stood at the right hand of gods for 4,000 years. Running. The done philosopher who had gone for a very long walk came home, opened his notebook, and started writing something new. The Ethari went silent for 9 days. Not communications silent, they had never been communicative. Presence silent. The 47 vessels above Kesov Prime stopped moving, stopped the subtle repositioning and energetic signaling they had maintained for 6 weeks. They simply sat, and in that stillness, every analyst who was watching the feeds read the same thing. They were arguing. Tessin, still aboard the Patient, spent those 9 days doing something that made her communications staff deeply uncomfortable. She slept. She cooked actual meals in the ship's galley. She read a novel she had been carrying in her bag for 4 years. When her aide finally broke down and asked how she could possibly be relaxed, she looked up from her book and said, "Because right now, the most dangerous thing I could do is move. So I'm not moving." Earth Command was less calm. They sent 17 messages in 9 days. Tessin acknowledged each one with the same reply, monitoring, stand by. The first private communique arrived on day 4 from the Vel Commerce Directorate. It was formally addressed to Earth Command, copied to the Patients, and written in the careful, triple-hedged diplomatic language of a species that was absolutely terrified of being overheard by someone they were talking about. Stripped of its qualifications, it said, "We are watching what you are doing. We would like to discuss the future of Concord tributary arrangements." Privately. The Sarathi message came on day 6. More direct, the Sarathi were a blunt species by nature, and years of submission had not entirely erased that. It said, "Your ship hurt the Herald. We did not think the Herald could be hurt. We have things to discuss." The done message arrived on day 9 and was a single line, "We are listening." Tessin forwarded all 3 to Dr. Adiz, who was by then embedded with the Joint Command as a strategic advisor. His reply took 40 minutes and was 40 pages long, but its core argument was simple. The wound in the Herald is not the victory. The victory is what the wound means. Every species in the Concord just watched a god bleed. That is not a military event. It is a theological one. Meanwhile, aboard the Ethari flagship, the High Choir, the collective of senior Ethari that governed their civilization's decisions, was doing something it had not done in recorded history. Disagreeing. The minority faction was explicit. The human fleet had to be destroyed, immediately, completely, before the idea spread further, before 3 species became 10, before 10 became 30, before the entire tributary structure, which was, when examined honestly, held together almost entirely by the belief that it could not be questioned, unraveled. They were not wrong. The majority faction's argument was less coherent but more powerful. Destroying the humans now would confirm that the humans had forced them to act. That was worse than losing. That was acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that the humans had done something worth responding to. That they mattered. That they had, in some way, won. The majority won the argument, which meant they did nothing. Which was exactly what Tessin had predicted. She closed her novel, made coffee, told her aide to prepare a formal negotiating position. Then she added one more document to the package, Dr. Adiz's essay, the one he had begun writing the day the Herald retreated and completed in 4 sleepless days, which was already circulating through every conquered species that had access to the relay network. He had titled it, On the Mortality of Gods. It would eventually be translated into 237 languages. But in those 9 quiet days above Kesov Prime, what mattered was that the Ithari read it too. The Ithari came in force on a Tuesday. Later, historians would find something almost unbearably human about that detail, that the battle which changed the shape of the galaxy was logged in human fleet records under a weekday, between a fuel resupply entry and a crew rotation notice. But that was how real history happened. Not in dramatic moments announced in advance, but in ordinary time between ordinary things, when ordinary people had to make extraordinary choices. 90 Ithari vessels entered the pale meridian at 900 hours, emerging from fold space in a formation that the fleet's tactical AI flagged immediately as offensive convergence pattern, no known analog. Because there was no known analog. No one had ever seen the Ithari in a battle formation before. No one had needed to. Voss had been expecting something. Not this much of something, but something. She had used the 9 days of Ithari silence to reposition, resupply, and make 3 very quiet calls to the Vel, Sarathi, and done diplomatic contacts who had reached out to the patients. She had not promised them victory. She had promised them honesty, which was rarer and, she argued, more valuable. When the Ithari fleet cleared fold space and oriented toward the human armada, they found 17 human warships holding the center of the pale meridian. Expected, predictable, the kind of futile last stand that could be swept aside in minutes. Then the flanks materialized. 6 Vel warships, running modified IFF codes that broadcast human-designated allied status. 2 Sarathi dreadnoughts, older than most human ships but armored so heavily they were essentially mobile fortresses. A Dun carrier, smaller than its counterparts but launching a wing of interceptors that had been designed, over 400 years, for exactly the kind of energy-based weapons the Ithari preferred. 90 against 26. The math was still terrible, Voss knew it. She had the math memorized. She also had something the Ithari didn't. She had officers who had learned to fight in the machine succession, where the enemy adapted mid-battle and losing a ship didn't mean stopping. She had crews that had been trained not for the battle they planned, but for the battle that actually happened. And she had, somewhere in her instincts, the memory of every human strategist who had ever looked at an impossible situation and found the one angle that wasn't covered. The first 10 minutes were brutal. The Ithari's energy projection weapons were unlike anything in the human database. They didn't fire in straight lines. They bloomed, expanding fields of dissolution that couldn't be dodged conventionally. The destroyer Kavanaugh lost her forward section in the first exchange. The cruiser Meridian Cross took a bloom hit that fused her port engine block. 3 Vel ships pulled back to reform. Voss didn't stop, she didn't regroup, she pushed forward. Because here was what 47 Ithari vessels above a peaceful planet had no preparation for, an enemy that accelerated toward the fire. The bloom weapons needed distance to expand to lethal radius. Inside that radius, they were manageable. Voss drove her formation into the Ithari fleet's envelope and turned the battle from a ranged energy exchange into something close and vicious and human in the worst and most effective way. They fought for 4 hours and 11 minutes. 7 human ships were destroyed. 2 Vel cruisers were lost. The Dun carrier was crippled, but its crew kept the interceptor wing running on auxiliary power for 3 additional hours, which was how the Unbroken survived the second Herald that the Ithari deployed in hour 3. This Herald lasted 9 minutes in the fight. When the Ithari fleet began to withdraw, Speaker 1's transmission said tactical repositioning, but the vectors were unmistakable. 11 of their 90 vessels had been destroyed. In 3,000 years, they had never lost 11 vessels. They had never lost one. The distinction between tactical repositioning and retreat was a philosophical one, and they had just fought a species that had no patience for philosophy. Voss sat in her damaged bridge, surrounded by the smell of burnt circuitry and the sound of damage control teams shouting coordinates to each other, and she did not feel triumphant. She felt tired and sad for the dead, and absolutely certain they had done what needed to be done. She filed the after-action report herself, with the lights on the bridge still flickering. Her final line read, "Enemy withdrawal confirmed. Recommend immediate diplomatic engagement before momentum is lost." Mara Tessin boarded the Ithari flagship alone for the second time, carrying the same notepad, the same pen, and a thermos of coffee she had made herself that morning. The amber light drew her shuttle in again. The 3-kilometer hangar received her again, but this time only 2 Ithari waited, and this time they did not send the pressure. Speaker One's form was different from the last time she had seen it, subtler, the layered luminescence closer to the body, the edges less expansive. A smaller presence. She noted it without comment. She had spent enough years at negotiating tables to know that how someone occupied space told you more about their position than anything they said. "You destroyed 11 of our vessels," Speaker One said. "Your fleet engaged ours," Tessin said. "Our vessels destroyed 11 of yours, yes. We also lost 7 ships and a great number of people I would like to honor properly before this conversation goes much further." She uncapped her pen. "Their names are in the record. I'll need to return to that." The second Ithari, she had not designated this one before, so she marked it Speaker 2 in her notes, moved. Not toward her. Sideways in a slow arc, the way something moved when it was thinking by moving. 3 species stood with you, it said. 3 species made their own choices, Tessin said. We didn't compel them. We made a case, they evaluated it, and they decided. She paused. That is how it works when there's a choice to be made. There was a silence then that was different from the silences before. Earlier silences had been full of assessment. She had felt them pressing, measuring, calculating. This silence was something older. She let it sit. "What does humanity want?" Speaker One asked. It was the question Tessin had been preparing for since she first boarded the Cassidy's shuttle and flew toward a flagship the size of a small moon. She had 14 pages of formal language ready. She had legal frameworks, conquered treaty precedents, economic models, 6 alternative proposals. She said, "A seat at the table, equal standing in the conquered of worlds for all species currently under tributary arrangement. No more tribute from anyone, effective immediately." Another silence. "You ask on behalf of others," Speaker 2 said. "We ask with others," Tessin corrected. "There's a difference." The negotiation that followed lasted 11 days. Tessin slept 4 hours a night and ate her meals in the hangar, seated on a supply crate with her notepad across her knees. She did not win everything. The Ithari retained their territory, their resources, their ancient standing in the galactic community. They gave up the tributes. They gave up the unilateral right to demand compliance. They gave up, in the formal language of the Keshav Accord, the status of sovereign authority over species that had not entered agreements voluntarily. They did not admit to any of this being a concession. The accord was worded carefully enough that they could present it as a voluntary reorganization of relationships. Tessin had written it that way on purpose. She was not interested in humiliating them. She was interested in the outcome. Across the Concord, the news arrived differently in different places. The Vel government published the accord in full within hours and held its first free legislative session in 3 centuries the following week. The Sarathi sent no formal statement, but were observed removing the Ithari tribute markers from their government buildings over the course of a quiet weekend. The Dun philosopher published the 2nd volume of what was now a book, On the Mortality of Gods, and dedicated it, in the tradition of his people, to the dead of the Kavanagh and the Meridian Cross and every other ship and crew that had burned in the Pale Meridian. On the hull of the Unbroken, 3 weeks after the accord was signed, a crew member named Specialist Yara Os climbed outside in a hardsuit with a welding torch and a piece of hull plate and fixed a single line of text to the ship's forward section in 17 languages. She had written it herself. Voss had approved it in under a minute. It read, "Gods can bleed. Act accordingly." No one ordered her to do it. No one stopped her. The image traveled the relay network in hours and was reproduced, painted, carved, printed, broadcast on 100 worlds in the weeks that followed. Not because humanity told anyone to, but because some truths once shown cannot be unshown. The Ithari still exist. They are still ancient. They are still powerful beyond most measurement. But somewhere in the long memory of a civilization that had never been questioned, a new thing had taken root, small, sharp, and permanent. Caution. And in the quieter places of the galaxy, in the species that had bent for centuries under the weight of something they had believed was inevitable, something else was growing too. It didn't have a name yet. It was just the feeling of a spine, slowly, carefully straightening. And